The work of becoming more equitable, inclusive, and diverse within our congregations is justice work. If we cannot do this well, we cannot be effective as justice partners. What is that telling you about yourself into the personal of oppression, but what is that also telling you about yourself as far as the institutional? That is the question for everyone.
Could you repeat the question, Samuel?
Please. The question is, when you read that paragraph, what is it telling you about the personal oppression, but what is it also telling you about the institutional oppression?
Well, it reminds me that institutions are made up of people. That sounds so obvious, but that's what it's all about.
So what does that mean?
It means that if we want our institution, that is our church or our UU movement, to be effective, we need to be just within it and how we treat others, as well as what we do with outside of it.
Okay. See, Carol?
Yes. I think that there's, for me at least, the first part of that paragraph talks about why it's so important to allow myself to be vulnerable, to be able to put myself in positions where I trust that the mistakes I make will be called on and I will still be loved for that. And I think our congregations need to do the same.
Anyone else? So,
Ray Jane.
I'm sorry.
Ray Jane has her hand.
Oh, Regine, please.
Church differently.
Church differently. Tell us some more.
I think we need more inclusive language. I think we need different music. I think maybe we don't have an order of service and follow it every single Sunday. And, it's not what we expect that comes next. So.
Oh my gosh, we can't do good and proper order. You're going to shake things up by asking us to not be the same.
Yeah. So
Dan has his hand up.
Dan, okay. I guess I'm not seeing.
That's okay, I'm here. I think one way maybe to do that, at least in our church, would be to involve our youth more in our worship services and in things that we do, because they seem to be so far ahead of most of us who are much older than they are.
Love that.
So if that's true, why don't you involve yourself in their services? They're far ahead. Wouldn't you usually take the experts to be the model?
Well, I volunteered to teach the youth a couple times this past year, and we were supposed to be teaching them about oppression and racism, things like that. And I found out they were way ahead of most of our adults in our church already. They can teach us.
You know why? Because we oppress them all the time. They're kids, right? They don't know the answers. We're the adults. We're oppressing them all the time. So they actually have a pretty close experience of it. Ask my 17-year-old.
That's good.
So we're always speaking about movement spaces. We're always speaking about this is where we ought to be as a congregation. This is where I ought to be as a person. We're always speaking about these movement spaces. And when we speak about movement spaces into equity, into inclusion, into diversity, I mean, these things sometimes it is wrapped up in the way as to how I may look at another person. How is it that you may look at me? And therefore, how do we conquer that? How do we relegate our thoughts, going back to what Carol said about the personal. And then we go back into the interpersonal, right? The interpersonal is about the interactions in which you have with me, I as a Black person, you, whether you are a white person or not, then does that interaction look like? How could that become oppressive? What do you think, Mel?
I think I was just trying to listen to that for a second, Sam. And I actually want to ask you a question.
Please.
How come you can come into a white UU setting and function?
That's a good question. Oh boy, do I have that answer for you. I haven't given that answer in a long time. So I left my Anglican faith and I came out and I came into, I was looking for a church and I became a UU. Well, yeah, there were various things that happened first there, of course, but it was easy, I find it was easy to accept me as a LGBTQ person, but I have to tell you, friends, when I began to talk about my Blackness, it was like there was a hush. There was a hush. And I began to see, I began to notice, I began to feel why. Now, remember that I came from a Christian faith, whereby, it's this utopian way of thinking. Then I come into a place whereby I think not just my sexual orientation would be accepted, but my wholeness would be accepted. But then I had to learn. Does that answer the question, Mel? I think.
You answered it from your perspective.
Yeah.
What I was there. I mean, I think one of the challenges is that for people of color who come into Unitarian Universalism, often we get drawn in by false advertising. Mm-hmm. We read the principles, we hear the words, and they sound good and they make you feel good when you look at them and you hear the stories. I remember, quite honestly, that when I was in the civil rights movement growing up a young man, it was the James Reeves and Viola Luiso and Selma stories. They weren't history to me. These were differences in the culture where I saw some white people who acted like Christians, in terms of loving their brothers and sisters and putting themselves on the line. And that I felt like they were being able and willing to be at risk as human beings for something greater than any of us had in the here and now. And I remember how that gave me some hope and courage that this faith called Unitarian Universalism was a different kind of faith, that it was a place that might be where my fullness, as Samuel just said, that my wholeness of who I was might be able to meet another authentic wholeness of other people. And together we would try and begin to create this beloved community. And I think one of the challenges for us is that we have the words, we have the languages. What's that other thing about the interpersonal? Oh, behaviors. The problem was the behaviors often when inside the walls. And when we came in to UU churches sometimes, even when I was working for the UUA, I would sometimes go visit a church and people who didn't know who I was be willing to greet me at the door and either ask me if I was looking for the Baptist church or if I was there, not to worry, because this is kind of an intellectual place, but don't worry, it'll be a good place and you'll be safe here. And I'm not kidding. These are real statements that were made to me when I was on staff traveling around the country at our UU congregations, and even told I could sit down front. And some of that is that our sense and understanding, quite honestly, of really authentically being able to see whites and blacks and others in this country as authentically, truly equals simply has not existed even within Unitarian Universalism.
Yeah.
And I think and I'm saying that now because one of the things is we've done some great things. We've done a lot of justice stuff, but in terms of race, a lot of our justice work have been animal rights, not human rights. It's been to try and say that we don't think you should be treated as critters, or that we think you ought to be more recognized and not punished for in the ways that, you know, that people would be, but still, I don't quite see you as my equal. And I know that's hard for many people to hear because they think in their own heads they do, but their behaviors tell me absolutely something different. And until we can own that and claim that and understand that, and if somebody just said about the youth, a lot of the youth don't buy into that. They're operating and seeing each other as they are in a different way. They're not the blinders of either intellect or the old histories or whatever. And we're not going to, if we don't find a way to figure that out honestly, many of us our age and others coming on, we are not going to have a faith. We don't have much to offer to the future of our kids and our children and the people that are coming into the pews. If we don't understand, they're serious about trying to take each other seriously in our first principle about the worth and dignity of all people, not mouthing it, not articulating it, but living it. And so we still, in many of our congregations, don't live it fully yet. And so I think this is another moment in time when we are, with this effort, widening is giving us an opportunity to take another shot at doing it right. We didn't get it right in the 60s. We didn't get it right with journeying towards wholeness. The issue is we don't have a lot more times to get it right. And so I think that's part of the gift and the opportunity we have at this moment in time. And I'm really excited that this district and you are taking it seriously to begin to raise those questions and begin to question, what does it mean to be a Unitarian Universalist today? What does it mean to, in fact, live and have the behaviors of those principles in my everyday life, both within the walls and without? So anyway, that's just part of the opportunity I see for us at this moment in time, Samuel, and others.
Thank you so much, Mel. Jeff, I saw your hand, Jeff.
Yeah, the issues around welcoming Black faces in our congregations is a big one, and all our white congregations struggle with that. One of the elephants in the room is class. We don't talk about class. We don't talk about working people being welcomed into our congregations where most people have a post-baccalaureate degree. We say, well, you're welcome here as long as you think like us. And is that really what we're about? Or do we need to look at welcoming, looking at the issues of class as well as the issues of color? Because they're different creatures. Because, you know, when we say, well, we're more than happy to welcome Black folk into our congregations, mentally we're thinking, yeah, they're the professors at the university, or there's an executive who works for Procter & Gamble. You know, that's the Black face we're thinking of. And I think that we are deeply challenged by that question.
Yeah. So in concert with what you had just said there, Jeff, when we speak about climate change, what comes to your mind? How do you view climate change? How do you? I'm not asking about the congregation yet, but how do you view climate change when you hear that we need climate change?
Well,
you could go right on, Nancy.
I'll jump in there. As some of you know, I work closely with the Green Sanctuary program for UUA, and we have just changed our whole program in order to respond to climate urgency. And the justice piece of it is so important and in line with the what we need to be doing in terms of partnering and listening to frontline communities and working with them in responding to the challenges of climate change that are much harder for communities that already are under stress. And so when I think of climate change in the context of UU values, I think of the need to really take a look at what is happening to marginalized communities around the world, and particularly in our country, and how we can pay attention to the things that need to be done to change our own lives, to change our congregational lives, to try to ameliorate the challenges of climate change and to keep it from getting any worse than it already is.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else? So could I have us all turn to page 70?
Actually, can I add one last thing?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, Jeff asked about class, and I just wanted to remark that this work doesn't center class. It's focused on race, and that's a really hard one for our communities to deal with. There's such a deep entrenched counter to we don't talk about race. We might know to not say that we're colorblind, as Lori mentioned in the chat, but we don't really know how to talk about race and feel like we're not putting our foot in it all the time, or somebody's going to get angry or hurt, or we're going to say show something. And so what I found myself in exploring this work deeply for the last couple of years, but on the edge of it for 20 years, has been that I'm starting to think about oppressions much, much more explicitly, much, much more. How am I behaving in a way? Who am I in a situation? You know, I'm a white, female, cisgender, upper middle class, educate. I mean, you know, I start to understand my own position in the systems better. And so though I'm not focused on race, I mean, on class in this work, I become a less oppressive person overall, and that allows me to listen better, I think, to folks in other class situations, and to see my own biases showing up and realizing that, you know, hey, there's some areas I need to work on still.
Sammy, can I real quickly?
Please, go right ahead, man.
It's interesting. I think one of the challenges is that when we talk about race and class, often it's about, well, our churches don't attract people because our intellect and the other thing. No, our churches don't attract people because they don't treat them as people. And the issue is not about, and the issue, if you want to learn more how to deal with class, we ought to have more Black people, because there are a lot of Black folks who understand class, and they could educate white people about how to deal with class if they were in relationship. So there's another reason. The other fact is that we don't know how to deal, white Unitarians and many white denominations don't actually know how to deal with poor white people. And therefore, when it's not about just, even to say it's about, we don't get Blacks, no, we don't get poor, we don't get working class white people. Because that's not how we see them as equal to us, or we're uncomfortable, haven't been taught and haven't learned how to be able to interact with people on a variety of capacities and understandings. I grew up in a congregation in a church of time of segregation, where in segregation, we had white members of our congregation. We had people who were doctors, PhDs, business owners, and people who were on welfare and barely making it. And they were all part of our church. And the issue was, if you're part of our church, you're a member of our church. And our job is to get to know each other as people and accept each other as a religious community. So there are lots of models for that being real out in the world. So when I hear a lot of us say it's about this and it's about that, that's not my experience. I grew up in a whole system of churches and times when we had a whole comprehensive relationship across race, class, gender, all those things. Our head usher was gay at that time, at a time when that wasn't even acceptable, and everybody knew it. The choir person who had a lifelong relationship with another woman, everybody knew it. They were partners, and the issue was everybody was seen as part of St. Philip's congregation. We were a family together, and we worked together and cared about each other and learned from each other.
Yeah. So how do we move that over? How do we move that kind of a spirit in which is there, the fact that when we're speaking of a church, we're speaking of people accepting people for who they are. So if you could open up your book to page 70 under environmental justice, going to share some thoughts around that. If you have the book open, could someone read what is said there by Paula Cole-Jones? The formation of environmental justice movement. Could someone read that? Do you see that page?
I can share it if you want.
Yeah, please. Okay. Yes. Could someone read that, please?
It has long been understood that unpopular environmental decisions often follow the path of least resistance, but we should expand that assertion to include the path of structured or institutional discrimination. To say that the decisions follow the path of least resistance takes the focus off the systemic nature of oppression, specifically who gets to make decisions. There are many examples of communities of color and low-income communities that are at risk due to pollution from the placement of industrial sites, environmental waste disposal, resource retrieval or use, and air and water pollution. These communities often bear the negative historical impact of racial and ethnic segregation, income inequality, and limited access to resources and policymakers.
So I'm going to say it. During the presidential debate, a question was asked. The question was asked about individuals who are living in certain places, and the answer in which the current president gave was distasteful. The fact that, yes, people of color could live in those lands and they're making money and, they are getting this, they're getting that. And then his opponent said, no, that's not what it is. The fact that they're living in fenced communities. How many times did the fact that the railroad is always built through a person of color land? How is it that the most environmental things is built on the lands of people of, we have examples, numerous examples of this. So when we speak about the climate change, and this is why sometimes for me, I get a little, bit terse in the sense that we don't put environmental justice in the same way as we put climate change. So when we're speaking about climate change, are we speaking of environmental justice? They should go hand in hand because it all affects our environments. But environmental justice, we speak towards, we should be inclusive and not to be erasure of those within the people of color lands. So this within itself tells us about the institutional now, as far as where policies are made, things are being done. So I'm going to ask Carol if you could lower your screen or unshare your screen. Thank you. Back in about 2004, I went to my very first anti-racism training. And in the book, we've looked at the 4 oppressions. What I have is what was called at that time, which was called the power analysis of racism. So it spoke about the personal again. It speaks about the institutional again. And this may be bringing back old memories to my friend Mel. Like you have the personal, you have the institutional, you have the spiritual. And there it says there is power 1, there's power 2, and there's a power 3, which speaks about the way as how we, you and I, BIPOC folks, people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, and whites, how do we create an analysis of what racism is? See, and the power structures are all here. That is what the book is helping us to see, these 4 levels of oppression. You have a thought, Mel?
Well, I think that part of it is that historically so much of the understanding or ability to see those things has been culturally hidden. It's been disguised. So it's difficult sometimes for people to really be able to actually see the underpinnings of some of the dynamics of institutional rights and relationships and how things function. And I think having a set of lenses intentionally to kind of help people kind of penetrate that or see that is something that sometimes people have to be equipped with or be helped to be able to better understand. And that's not a negative, but just simply saying it's an important tool for trying to be able to discover together collectively how we can see in the real roots of some of the problems and dynamics. And I think that's sometimes been a challenge within our faith, because some people think that's putting them down or thinking that's kind of making fun of them or that they're saying they're stupid or they're, and that when you're an intellectual person, that's a really difficult thing. But it's really saying, no, that there's some things that you simply haven't been taught, you haven't learned. And the problem is that we can't have a real conversation till we all have enough of the same language and understandings of dynamics and realities and function so that we together can figure out how we can move forward for something that can survive and help all of us together. We haven't had that conversation within our faith on an equal basis yet. And I think this is part of the challenge and opportunity of this time for us to figure out how to do that. Again, we haven't yet learned it. That doesn't mean we can't learn how to do it. And I think that's part of what I'm hoping people are entering into this. And I think particularly for many whites who are good folks and really want to see things different, but haven't had some of the tools and some of the understandings yet to be able to figure out how to develop, to work in partnership, to create something that works for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mel. So we have been talking here, those in UUJ have been talking. We want to hear from you. What are you feeling? What is bubbling up inside of you as you hear these comments, as you hear these words? What's coming within your space? Christine. Oh, it's Christine. Hi, Christine.
Hi. So just in hearing the conversation about environment, I went to what I most recently been working on in justice, of course, which is, or in our justice work, is Get Out the Vote, UU the Vote. And just like environment, I come into it from a perspective of, the typical conversation of we just need to get people out to vote. Same thing with environment. We just need to get people to change what they're doing and what their practices are and all of that. But in hearing this discussion and conversation with the environment thing, I'm like, I've never really thought about all the different areas and how who's impacted by it most. I've thought about people who are living on floodplains, and I think about Katrina and how that was, impacted people and how that's just going to get worse. But I never really thought about, the underpinnings of it, as you said, Mel, the underpinnings of how that came to be, the underpinnings of how these areas are intentionally, in many ways, so designed to be that way. And it's the same thing with Get Out the Vote and the oppression that's happening in our state, even, and our country to stop the vote. The areas where it's hardest to vote, it's hardest to get to the polls, it's hardest to do this, are the areas that are intentionally built for generations to make it hard for a certain group of people, and specifically Black, Indigenous people of color. And just starting to think about those underpinnings in all of these things that are justice oriented, no matter what we're doing, I'm pretty sure you could ask the same question of any justice issue and say, this is the same through all of them. If we separate the two, we miss an entire part of the justice work that we need to be doing. And in fact, the core of that justice work that we need to be doing, if we separate the two, we miss that. So I think it's really important to bring that up and to be thinking about that, especially on our justice team and how we're working forward. And with our ally groups too, is to start looking for those underpinnings within our congregation. Look at where are those places in our congregation that have already been set up for generations, that have been impacting people that we don't know, we haven't looked at. Make it conscious, bring it to our consciousness, and scrutinize with magnifying glass over what are those underpinnings.
Right.
Thank you. Anyone else? What is coming up for you? Hi, Carolyn.
Hi. For me, it's like, how do you go out? You know, we talk about bringing people in, but how do we go out and be part of
Their lives,
their space, and not to be a leader in their space, but to be one of their people, one of their supporters, you know, just, you know, and I find myself going out into spaces that to just be there with the people in different spaces. Mm-hmm. Like we just formed an NAACP. They formed an NAACP and we started racial, I can't remember exactly what they call it now, but it's a coalition for racial justice here. It was started really by the young people in Licking County who organized a vigil for Black Lives Matter. And they took it on themselves to organize that. And my job was just to show up. Yeah. And my job still is just to show up. And so it's not bringing them to us as much as we need to go to them.
I really want to second that. People always say, what can I do? Show up. Be supportive. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Anyone else? What is coming up for you?
Catherine says what?
Yeah, Catherine said, listen and follow. Yes, listen and follow. But
can I ask her to say, what does she mean? Carol, what do you mean by that? If you don't mind just chipping in. Would you share that?
Can you hear me? Good, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Uh-huh. My laptop is playing tricks. I'm really here. What I mean is having some humility, having some manners. As a white person, I was not taught to have manners toward people of color. And so as I go through the world, I remind myself I'm no longer under my dad's instruction. And so I give myself the instruction to listen to my siblings of color and follow their lead. That's all.
That's not just all, that's a lot.
Yeah. Anyone else? What else is coming up for you here? So if you're not going to speak now, let's say that you're going to speak next week when you come back, right? Because there's going to be some homework in which we're going to leave you with. If you look in your book, if you look at from page 71, from page 71 to page 74, there is some takeaways, there's some recommendations. We're going to be talking about that. So we will encourage you with everything you have as you've read that. Come back next week and we're going to be speaking less. So, and you're going to be speaking more. And we hope that you will be back with us. Any questions so far?
What's the homework?
That's the homework. That's the homework. Any questions in which you have so far? No? Okay.
Sammy, I just want to say, one thing we can all do, even though, come back next week, hang in there. I know that sounds so simple. Hang in there. And it's not going to be perfect right now. We're going to have to figure it out together. So let's hang in with one another and use our UU commitment and character and commitment to one another just to say we're going to just figure it out together. I don't have to always know. I'm not always going to know. But together, we're going to finally figure out some better ways for more of us to survive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Joan.
A bit of housekeeping. If anybody has any trouble finding the text online or downloading it or getting the PDF, just email me. I put my info in the chat and I'll help you.
Yes.
And I just put the link to the PDF or the text itself. Like if you want the chapters on the website, you can go there too.
Awesome. Thank you. So how were you feeling today? How are you feeling when you leave here today? I know there's a lot of stuff that's happening outside. As you see, I didn't mention that, or we didn't mention that. A lot of
We
stuff.
stayed on topic really well.
That's right. There's a lot of that stuff is out there.
Amazing.
So we try to stay on widening our circles. Any other thoughts? Last chance before Linda will close us out.
Well, when somebody said it was hard, Samuel.
Oh, I missed that.
Yeah.
I missed the chat.
What
No, I'm sorry. That was a joke. Someone said we stayed on topic. We didn't talk about the election.
Oh, okay. I celebrate
I have a
that.
question.
That's right.
Does anybody think that their congregation will, how do you think your congregation might react to the widening the circles and living our values?
I think our
That's a good question.
I think our ally group could really use looking at it, and I'm trying to think of how we can incorporate that into our work in the ally group, because that's our role, is to be keeping an eye on this. So I definitely am going to think about that.
I have a hunch that by what's happening, quite honestly, in the election and what's going on in our country right now, that we are not only needed in the country, and I mean that for our faith, our principles, those things we lift up and talk about being our faith, are needed within our country. So I want to really challenge you and others and myself. We have something to contribute at this moment in history, not only within our walls, but outside our walls. We have some history, we have some understandings, we have some ways of relating. It's not perfect, but it's sure ahead of where a whole lot of other people are. And we can start with that and we can grow from that and we can let other people know, fear not, be not afraid, you can survive. And I really hope that if nothing else, that we and this district and others begin to see we as a faith have something that the country needs for democracy to survive. Yeah. And I really do believe that. And I'll be glad to talk to anybody more about that and think of other things. And this document that we're talking about is the beginning of something that could be culture changing.
Very much so. It's kind of interesting is the fact that when we look at the landscape in which we're living in, and we see how things are shifting, both culturally, of course, but we're also seeing how things are shifting interpersonally, how people and their attitudes are changing. And this year, I thought it have gotten a little bit worse this year. So friends, we have work to do in Ohio. You have work to continuously do in your congregations, your organization, wherever you are. There is work that's got to get done. And we want to work with you. We want to, in any way we can, but it's also your work to take back to your congregation. So thank you for being here. We wanted to make sure that we use our time in a way that it will be beneficial. Thank you. And we will have, again, next week, next Thursday, we will be back here at 7 o'clock. And again, that's what I said. This is when you will be speaking more. So come prepared, come ready. The formats is all there. We'll be speaking of the recommendations. We'll be speaking of the actions, and we will be speaking of the takeaways. All right. So, again, we will be hearing from you. Linda.
Ancestral healing. It is liberating to consider that when we heal an ancestral pattern, we are not only freeing future generations, but healing backwards through time, liberating all those souls who were left unresolved, unforgiven, and misunderstood. This comes from Belonging, Remembering Ourselves, Home by Toko Pa Turner. Thank you.
So